The only thing the Canadians probably are offended by are those who don't want to adapt.
The Hong Kong people that we get in Australia are not the most suitable immigrants for Australia.
Making a new life, emigrating to Australia and Canada. But it's a process of leaving Hong Kong, leaving home. Tonight, on Focus. Canada, a land of 25 million people. And many contrasts. Americans and Latins filling a baseball stadium in Montreal. Black Canadians bringing fun and fantasy on Carnival Day in Toronto. 1/2 of Canada's population is neither British nor French. And defending these people are red-coated soldiers. Horses and cattle are also part of Canada's way of life. And that industry is part of Australia's way of life too. That country is home to about 15 million people. Unlike Canada, most of the people in Australia are still from British stock. But even though it was overwhelmingly British in outlook, Australia still attracted a lot of Chinese settlers in its early history. Like the Canadian gold rush, the Australian gold rush in the 1840s brought in a lot of Chinese immigrants. Gold fever, wanting to get rich quick. That started Chinese immigration to Australia and Canada. In Australia, things didn't go too well for the Chinese. Wellington Lee is a 4th-generation Chinese Australian. He knows his history.
All Chinese suffered extreme prejudice in those days. At that time, the history of the Chinese in Australia would be a very sad one. Other Australians, mostly Anglo-Saxon Europeans at that time, I think were not used to a different culture, a different race.
In Canada, things weren't any different. Chinese settlers also suffered racial discrimination at the hands of European immigrants. But when the Chinese were needed to build the Canadian Pacific Railway, conditions were a little bit better, because they were part of a national policy. Eileen McIntyre is an associate professor at the University of Toronto in Canada. She knows how Canadian society developed.
Historically, in Canada, immigration policy has always been economic policy. In the early days, it was our need for labor. Sometimes skilled labor, sometimes unskilled labor.
In Australia, the Chinese also became part of the labor market. Historian John Young has this comment.
And the Chinese were their sojourners at first. In other words, they arrived thinking they would make some money and then go back to the native land. So I don't think they made a big fuss out of racism until there were economic competition. Then you had all sorts of problems. The Chinese were paid less, and of course they worked harder than anybody else and earned less wages. And so that created a lot of jealousies, especially with the white minorities. You know, there were constant feuds between the Chinese and the Irish and the Welsh and other continental Europeans.
But after the governments of Australia and Canada no longer needed Chinese laborers, they were discarded. A few went back to China, but a lot more stayed on. Those who stayed and had enough money to start a business opened restaurants and laundries, and it became a stereotype that all the Chinese could do was to cook meals and wash dirty clothing. In Canada, the Chinese were banned completely from entering the country in 1923. But after Chinese-Canadian soldiers distinguished themselves in World War II, this Exclusion Act was lifted. And in 1947, the Chinese in Canada even got the right to vote. In Australia, things weren't that rosy either. Its government had a white policy. It barred non-white immigrants.
After World War II, you had all these European immigrants coming in, the Greeks and the Italians especially. And that's the time when the government decided that it wants a very institutionalized form of white Australia policy.
But the white policy ended in the 1970s. Why?
Well, I think you start having a more liberal government. Australia started to become part of the world. The government tried very hard to push for changes, and they realized that Australia is actually part of Asia.
There's no white policy now in Australia. Chinese settlers have emigrated to the country. But have things changed when it comes to the social conditions in Australia?
Government tried to stress that they want unity through diversity, or multiculturalism. They have all these beautiful terms. But I see discrimination, at least in Melbourne, every day.
But despite that, people still go to Australia as a refugee, or to join their families, or to invest with at least 500,000 Australian dollars. So for any Hong Kong investors wanting to emigrate to Australia on the business migration program, they've got to have a lot of money just to get in. But once Hong Kong immigrants do get in, some people think there isn't anything to worry about. Jimmy Chow was once an Australian immigrant.
I don't really feel Australia is a place will make you feel uncomfortable. The Hong Kong people, they're used to a lot of the westernized way of life, way of living, even with food.
Canada also has a three-faceted immigration policy: refugees, family reunion, and the independent class. In the independent class, there's an entrepreneurial or a business migration program, quite similar to Australia's policy. But there is a big difference. You don't need a set amount of money.
Most of the people that do immigrate in this program are not billionaires or millionaires. They're people with $100,000 or $200,000 who have managed to gather that together and hope to open a small business.
The Canadian Commission was very cooperative in this story. The Australian Commission, however, was not. It refused to grant us an interview, but Focus managed to dig up these facts. This is a Chinese school in Australia. The students, or their parents, are part of some 18,000 people who have emigrated, mostly from Hong Kong. This year so far, more than 2,000 Hong Kong immigrants have settled in Australia. The prediction is that 5,000 annually will settle in the next 10 years. In Canada, the recession plunged immigration intake to zero demand between 1981 and 1985. Only immigrants with cash on hand to invest and jobs to create were admitted. Dr. Eileen McIntyre has this point of view on Canadian immigration.
The Canadian economy is undergoing some very major changes. We are